Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to ECCHR event series, Human Rights in Times of Crisis, of Resistance and Concrete Utopias. This event was actually planned back in 2019 together with our cooperation partner, the Federal Agency for Civic Education, obviously as an event in presence together with workshops, because even by that time we were aware that we as human rights organizations are facing a multiple and very complex global crisis, climate crisis, crisis of water, of food, growing authoritarianism, which requires a new discussion with new actors, with other actors than the very close human rights community. And obviously, with the current pandemic crisis, it became even clearer that a conversation is needed. We're hoping that at some point in the upcoming months, we will be able to fulfill our function as ECCHR to serve as a platform, as a hub for actors beyond Germany, beyond Europe, beyond law, an interdisciplinary mixed coalition of people. But as Alejandra Ancheta from Mexico said, we have to maintain our internationalist spirit, and so we have to bridge until this time has come. And so this is why we decided to aggregate one more online conference series to the endless series we're having already.
We want to talk about the role of human rights in the fight against climate change, and we want to discover the relationship between activism and human rights lawyering. I will introduce to you now our panels for today, guests on the panel, for today. So we have Arpitha Kodiveri, who is a human rights lawyer and a doctoral researcher in law at the European University Institute in Italy. She researches land conflicts and legal mobilization by forest-dwelling communities in Indian mining areas. We are very happy to have you. Then also we have Luisa Neubauer, who is Fridays for Future coordinator and organizer and one of the most prominent members of the German branch. Currently, she's enrolled in a master's degree on resource analysis and management at the University of Göttingen. Welcome, Luisa. And then, last but not least, we have César Rodríguez-Garavito, who is a well-known human rights and environmental law scholar and practitioner. He is co-director of the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at New York University, and he is editor-in-chief on open global rights. His work focuses on global governance, climate change, socio-economic rights, and business and human rights. Welcome, César. So, yes, the topic we have today is obviously a very big one. The man-made climate change crisis is one of the most pressing crises that humanity currently faces. It is the consequence of a capitalist economic model based on high carbon-intensive industry, on resource extraction. And it puts very much into question not only the existence of our planet as we know it, but in particular, I think it puts into question our economy and the Western way of life of consumerism. And obviously, I think something that should have realized by now everyone, it warrants a deep and fundamental change. And from my perspective, what human rights, I think what we'll need to discuss today is the question, well, to some extent, the urgency of this crisis is scientifically so well proven that it's really the question, why would we need human rights to fight for changes? And I guess from our perspective, One, obviously, human rights language gives certain credibility, certain value to the claim against governments to acknowledge the climate crisis and to act accordingly upon it. And I think the second aspect, which from my perspective is also equally, if not even probably more important now, is that human rights do put a framework and give language to demands on governments again, but also on corporations, on how to act upon this crisis, on how to implement government policies. And I think that's a very classic value of that human rights brings. So, so to some extent, I would say that human rights offer the opportunity to bring social questions into the discourse of climate justice and environmental justice, which may sometimes bear the risk of turning into the question of purely technical solutions to questions of for example, reduction of carbon emissions. But yes, I would want to give you the chance, probably also to our panelists, to do some things. And so what do you think is the added value of human rights? César, do you want to probably start with that?
Thank you, Miriam. I wanted to start by thanking ECCHR for organizing this panel and the series of panels. The ECCHR has certainly had a leading role in convening the human rights community around cutting-edge issues. So it really is a pleasure to be part of this panel, especially given that Arpitha and Luisa, very distinguished panelists, are also with us. So I would say that human rights contributes two key elements to climate action. One, you already alluded to, Miriam, which is a language, that embodies, that concretizes climate harms. A paper and a book that I'm publishing documents how the environmental movement saw very early on in the first decade of this century that human rights could be a very powerful tool to advance arguments that were falling on deaf ears, because back then climate change was seen as a scientific, abstract environmental concern with limited impacts on human beings. So it was an issue that supposedly affected polar bears as opposed to human beings. But towards the 2010s, and then decisively about 5 years ago, around the Paris Agreement negotiations, the environmental community pushed the human rights movement to take human rights implications of climate change seriously. And that's when the turning point happened that led us to successful litigation like the one that Luisa has been part of in Germany with this landmark decision of the German Constitutional Court just a couple of months ago. And then the second element that human rights contributes to the climate struggle is an institutional architecture. Human rights advocates organizations from the Global South and the Global North have been working for decades, constructing with some governments this human rights architecture that takes the form of courts like the European Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, but also the UN human rights bodies that are there to be mobilized for the purpose of prompting governments and corporations to do the right thing. So it was by seizing the opportunities of this already existing architecture that climate activists and human rights advocates came together to create the momentum that we're luckily seeing today.
Thank you, César. Yes, you already mentioned that Luisa has been one of the claimants in the successful Constitutional Court claim on climate change that just came down. Luisa, why, what was your motivation, not just individually, but also as Fridays for Future, to say you want to be engaged in such a human rights claim?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the question and thank you for having me. So it's great to be here with you. I think there has been you could call it societal, but maybe it's even a philosophical misunderstanding in especially Western worlds, what climate protection, climate mitigation, climate action is really about. And for decades, protecting the environment was considered to be something you would do for charity. That was a good deed. Protecting the birds as somewhat of an equivalent to giving some children some sweets. It's something you do when you have time and money, and it's something you don't do if you have anything better or more important to do. And it's only been in recent years, and I think maybe even Fridays for Future has played a part in that this fatal misunderstanding got twisted and turned around and shifted towards an understanding that what eventually this is about saving us from ourselves and from the dangers we put ourselves in. And by we, I explicitly, of course, mean mostly white powers of the global north. And then, of course, there's a different dimension when it comes to global south and global north justice. So in this understanding, of course, that everything we do in terms of the climate crisis is not a favor which would do to the climate or the atmosphere. It changes our understanding of what kind of legitimacy we have. And this brought us and brought me to a point where we really thought about the injustices that we are seeing and the lack of the lack of legitimacy that the climate crisis has. So, of course, it was a very natural step for us to, as soon as we acknowledge that what is being done is actually harming our rights and human rights and our rights to future and freedom and so on, it was a logical step for us to also go to court, as we are trying to do everything we can. And this was one piece of the puzzle. Yeah. Yet I would, at that point, really want to emphasize on the point that there is a incredible barrier when it comes to the acknowledgement of human rights around the world. People do not fight for the rights that they don't know they have. And for a long time, people suffering from environmental degradation, suffering from the climate crisis, suffering from the perspective even of an escalating climate crisis, they didn't know they had a right to a safe planet.
Thank you. Arpitha, yes, Luisa just also nicely described sort of how probably environmental degradation has been a topic for longer, and how indeed, to some extent, probably for in Europe, it's, as you said, it is seen as a charity. I think I could, from what I would see, but I could see that this perspective is different if you're coming from the global south, where, from my experience, the connection between human rights and environmental fights are quite close. But maybe you can, explain us a bit from your perspective. What do you think about this?
Thank you so much for that. At the outset, I just want to say a huge thank you for having me, and it's so great to be a part of this panel. So I think both César and Luisa really laid the groundwork of the potential that human rights has in providing a vocabulary and a language. But now, what does that sort of, that language mean in the global south and in contexts like India? So I feel one of the big legal gains in the environmental legal movement in India has been a sort of rights-based approach both to conservation and impacts of environmental degradation. Whether you look at indigenous communities or Adivasi communities who've been struggling for their rights over land, there's always been an intrinsic link between rights claiming that happens through the human rights sort of framework, as well as this neatly tying in with ecological questions. But that's not to say that it's been entirely a story of coexistence. There are also fissures that do happen because colonial forest policies, as well as the history of exclusionary conservation, has led to the violation of the human rights of a lot of communities who depend on these ecosystems. So that has been sort of a human rights pushback, but at the same time, with the growing arguments of the rights of nature and the discourse around non-human rights, it's sort of percolating these older fissures again, whether there is a human rights approach that can sort of reach some kind of reconciliation between these competing ideas or not. So much more to discuss later, but I just want to leave it at this sort of two-pronged sort of value addition that human rights has. One, I think if we kind of look at how Karen Zivi argues that the rights is sort of rights claiming, it allows marginalized communities to occupy space within the law and state their claims. Depends whether they go to court or they do it through protest. So I think human rights in that sense has been a lived reality and has been a part of a lot of mobilization here, which I think can contribute to the growing discourse on human rights and the climate crisis.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. Indeed, I do hope we talk a bit more about this later on when we come probably also to what the challenges of human rights in the regard to climate change are right now. But César, I think you elaborated on the momentum that we can see that it has been developing in climate change, and maybe you take a bit more time even to describe this. But we've been sort of only in Germany and the neighboring Netherlands. The last three months probably have been very exciting. So you see constitutional courts granting rights to citizens as their rights are being violated by inactive governments or not sufficiently active governments. So do you think we've won the argument that governments are obliged by human rights to act on the climate crisis?
I think there's definitely momentum, and it's a momentum that's been building up since at least 2015. Again, in the study that I referenced earlier, I documented around 70 cases that were filed between 2015 and 2020 that basically laid the groundwork for the type of victories that the movement in Germany recently achieved remarkably before the Constitutional Court, especially in Europe. And I'll be happy to provide the link to the study in case if people are interested, because after 2020, this became an avalanche. And now, in my study now, we count almost 100 cases that are squarely based on human rights arguments. So the climate litigation has been around for 20-25 years now, but the use of human rights arguments, meaning the concretization of climate harms in the form of people displaced from their places of dwelling, people losing crops, losing their right to family, right to privacy, right to life, right of future generations. All of that is more recent, and definitely there is momentum, and around 50% of those cases are being litigated, as you said, Miriam, in Europe. Importantly, the Global South has had key litigation early on in 2016 in Pakistan, also litigation happening in Colombia, in India, and elsewhere. It is tempting to conclude that the argument has been won as a result of this very promising trend. But I think that would be premature for two reasons. First, because ultimately we as human rights scholars and practitioners care, and certainly people like Luisa, but I'll let her speak to this issue herself, care about the outcome, the impact, not just a fantastic piece of paper with a fantastically argued ruling like the one that the German Constitutional Court produced a couple of months ago. That's a crucial step. But in the end, the assessment needs to be made based on whether governments and corporations end up cutting emissions in half by 2030, achieving net zero emissions by 2050 in line with science and in line with what's needed to avoid a truly catastrophic planet for future generations. And the jury is still out on whether this is going to happen or not. Finally, what I would say is that it is absolutely crucial that strategic litigation based on human rights arguments against climate inaction involved and is done in partnership or in very close collaboration with social movements. So what's particularly encouraging to me, coming from other forms of litigation and advocacy in the past on socioeconomic rights, for instance, is that in the climate space, organizations like Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, indigenous peoples in the Amazon region have really been at the forefront of many of these cases, for example, currently in Brazil. So it's not a technical issue left to lawyers to solve or to push forward. If that were the case, and I say it as a lawyer, would be this battle would be lost because, of course, it is in the end direct mobilization, political mobilization, bottom-up mobilization that would push very powerful actors all the way from governments to fossil fuel companies, to soybean production companies in the Amazon, in the Brazilian Amazon, to be accountable for the climate harms that they produce and to stop polluting the planet in ways that will make it unsustainable for future generations.
Yeah, Luisa, do you want to probably, add on this or respond? So what are you, as Fridays for Future, planning on doing with the Constitutional Court ruling? Are you satisfied for it as of now, sort of, or what, or do you also see some downsides of the judgment? Actually, I would be interested in that. Or you've some issues where you feel, well, this needs to go further.
Well, first of all, of course, I cannot be satisfied about a victory against my own government. That's like, I wish it's my government too, and so I wish there wasn't the need for me to go to court against my own government. That's not something you want to do, living in a democracy. And so, of course, it itself is a huge thing, yet it's also a tragedy that this had to happen and that the court, explained how bad of a job what a bad job the government does. Well, as mentioned before, it's certainly, however, of course, some kind of revolutionary ruling. And the question, I think, is, of course, what do we do with it internally? And it will be for us, of course, that the one decision we will come back to again and again and again, asking the government to learn from that. Yet I think equally important, of course, is what do we do in terms of, using this precedent to force further governments towards climate justice. And I think that is a very exciting thought, as being pointed out before. There is, of course, this awkward situation that we are in Germany, that the government has made very clear that it, in fact, has not very much understood what this ruling is about, as, in fact, the Constitutional Court redefined what is freedom in the climate crisis. And that is a very, very big deal. And the response of the government was basically to go back and work in the same pattern as it did before. So the court got the government to a point that it again, decided on a insufficient climate target and insufficient measures without any acknowledgement that today we need to think drastically different about what does it mean to provide safety and freedom for people in democracies in the 21st century.
Thank you. Yes. Well, maybe we stay with that. With that ruling or with the language of human rights, and I want to turn to the question. Indeed, the Constitutional Court said, that the potential rights violations of the rights of freedoms of future generations are in danger. And obviously that's important, and it's as you said, it's revolutionary that they're also taking into account the future right, or the rights of persons living in the future. But shouldn't we also be a bit concerned about a very European Western approach to human rights, which is individualistic, so which means it's individual rights that I can claim. And is it not needed that we also think a bit more of broadening the human rights language more towards, more holistic concepts? And I think probably, I mean, maybe Arpitha, you can speak about this, because I think especially communities and also especially, I guess, indigenous communities in themselves don't think in terms of their individual rights necessarily as we probably here in Europe would conceptualize them. And what is that approach probably, or is there something that we in Europe can learn?
Right. So I think in terms of sort of a collective approach to human rights, I do think that advances have been made with group rights in general, but I do think there is a challenge with understanding, sort of putting a very apolitical reading of what that collective means. Because a lot of my fieldwork has shown that even indigenous communities, they sort of have multiplicity of interests. While, and I think a collective framing of rights as a community enables them to sort of, negotiate and come together and build consensus, which is very interesting when one is trying to mobilize human rights. So what kind of rights do they choose to mobilize? Whether it's cultural rights or socioeconomic rights, that sort of becomes a collective framing. And I think that's something that we can definitely learn, because I perhaps fear that individual rights might further create very divisive ways in which we might be using human rights and making these claims. And I think a more collective framework will engender consensus building, both in terms of how legal mobilization happens, as well as, stemming from the momentum that already exists. And I think with future generations, there is a sense of a collective. And I think the collective perhaps is a bit difficult for us to imagine, but I do think that it is in a sort of a group framing, which is fairly broad. And I do see hope in that, as well as the rights of nature, because there the community is more of looking at the ecosystem and the interconnections that we have with the non-human world.
César, do you want to speak on that also, because you come from the Colombian perspective, and in Colombia there's been some important decisions also made on the question of rights of nature, and then also process rights of communities determine, right? What are the rights of nature? So do you think that this is something we should also probably learn from in Europe?
Yeah, there are a few gaps and voids as in any field of social change and strategic litigation that are quite evident in the climate litigation field. And I'll speak to rights of nature in a moment, but there are a couple more that I wanted to highlight. First, there's very little litigation against corporations. So it's been mostly governments that have been held accountable for good reasons. Of course, there, as Luisa said, these are active governments that are supposed to protect rights by design, by definition, and yet they're postponing the protection of those rights or outright violating them by continuing to, for example, to promote fossil fuel extraction around the world. So only 10% of the cases that have been litigated anywhere around the world on human rights grounds, on climate action, have been filed against corporations. A recent victory in the Netherlands against Shell, in which a court mandated Shell to comply basically with the targets of climate, of greenhouse gas emission reduction that science advises in order to avoid the worst scenarios of climate change. That is a key precedent. Still probably will be appealed, so it's not firm, but it's a crucial step forward. And yet there's a whole range of corporate actors that continue to actively go directly against what humanity needs to do to avoid the worst versions of the climate crisis. Second gap is litigation on adaptation. So the Global South actually is responsible for, of course, as we all know, relatively small percentages of historical carbon emissions. Of course, countries like India or China these days contribute considerably to, or Brazil, to carbon emissions. But historically, they're nowhere near the US or Europe. But they will be the worst hit by the impacts of climate change. Everywhere, countries from the Caribbean to the Pacific Islands to South Asia are already suffering the very direct and dire impacts of climate change. So in Arpitha's country, in places like Chennai, whole regions of the world will probably be uninhabitable the second half of this century because of the sheer heat that humans and all species will have to suffer in those places. So there needs to be more action on adaptation, meaning having governments and corporations pay for the cost of adapting to the already inevitable effects of climate change, especially in the Global South. And finally, rights of nature as a new frontier. I think that this is certainly gaining momentum, and it's not only in Latin America or New Zealand or India, but these arguments are being brought to court very seriously around the world. And I think, as Arpitha said, that this is a crucial step forward because it means moving from an anthropocentric logic of protection of rights to an ecocentric logic of rights, which in the end is in tune, in line with what we know from science, about how the planet and how ecosystems work. Human beings are, of course, not independent from the rest of the planet. And it is by protecting the life, the existence, the integrity of trees, of water systems, of rivers, of oceans, that we have any chance of living an inhabitable planet for future generations.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this very useful overview, and also for showing where the gaps currently are in terms of where we focus our litigation. So when it comes to corporations, we've had in this series, had Alejandra Ancheta from Mexico speak to us, and also and one of her other colleagues. And they are helping an indigenous community in Mexico to, again, to claim their rights to free, prior, informed consent and their land rights against a French company, against the French energy giant EDF, which, and here's probably, I don't know if it's ironic or tragic or what it is, which is actually building wind parks, so which is going to sort of, trying to get into green energy, or is in green energy, which is something that probably is very, we all support. And I think that's also, and as you said, I also had to think about this, César, when you said about adaptation, and that's also what I meant about, is probably also the potential for human rights to bring into social aspects into how we're going to adapt this. Because I guess, all big corporations are by now claiming that they are going to go into energy neutrality, and that they will be, as I said, carbon neutral by 2030, 2040 or so. Even automotive industry is claiming that. But do we probably also take a close look on how they do it? Because building a wind park or expelling indigenous communities from national parks so that nature can recreate, and the indigenous people need to leave who never contributed to the crisis. That's something, for example, minority rights is also working on. Really is not the solution. So Luisa, what do you say? What are you demanding of corporations, and what do you think is what's the claim of Fridays for Future in that regard? And also how do you deal with this tendency of policies to go, yes, it's all about green energy, maybe no matter what, or so.
Yeah, it's I was really inspired, and it got me. I very much second what we just heard about, the complexity of the issue and how we need to acknowledge that complexity also when we think about methods to achieve climate justice. And there is this tendency of, especially like the court rulings you've been seeing in the past, that they do attempt to take this multidimensional complex issue and put it in some kind of linear logic, which is what the Constitutional Court, didn't quite do. They did talk about the ethics behind freedom and climate justice, yet at the same time, it allowed the governments to opt out and reduce all of that meaningful ruling to some kind of CO2 reduction policy. And that is dangerous, as there is a need to talk about CO2 reduction, of course, yet it's just really one puzzle piece of the whole issue that we're looking at. And as soon as we get into the question of, okay, how do we actually conserve nature, and what does nature conservation even mean, knowing that the way we talk about nature conservation is something that that is very much shaped and formed by colonialist ideals of what is nature and what is not nature, and who we are in nature. And that's the same accounts for when it comes to protecting and acknowledging indigenous rights and indigenous lands. That is not something you can, boil down to some kind of CO2 measurement and some CO2 calculation, but it really comes to our understanding of power and hierarchy. And so I think ideally the need to conserve or to at least stop mass extinction will force us into the point where we understand that climate action is not just about reducing CO2, but about challenging and questioning our very own way of living and being on and with this world. And this is an interesting question when it comes to cooperation. And coming back to your questions there, because we did see this landmark ruling against Shell. We did see action going on about Chevron. We had with Fridays for Future, we had big action against Siemens and so on. So we do see that there's a conflict growing, and I think that can be a very productive conflict. But of course, and I think we need to also be clear about this, corporations that have grown to become those mega superpowers, partly arguably more powerful than some countries, they will get whatever they can get. And there is no climate justice ethics behind it. And they will not care about what is right or wrong, and they will care about what they are allowed or legitimized to do. And so it's great if there is investment in clean energy, but we need to, it usually reproduces the power and rubbery-like mechanisms that produce this crisis in the first place. So I think we will need to be very, very careful how we fight, what we fight for, and the pathways that we create in terms of actually shifting our ways of living from fossil to post-fossil. But that will be tricky, and I think the example you just gave proves it, how tangled that is, and that is not a linear pathway they're in. It's not we're not at the stage where everyone is trying, and some are trying harder and some are trying less hard. Eventually, we will have to really redefine under which kind of rules, under which kind of norms we want to live and coexist. And I very much hope that this redefining will be led by those who've been suppressed, who've been struggling, who should be leading this fight, and who have, who know so much more about what sustainability and sustainable living is actually, what it's actually about. In particular, I of course refer here to indigenous knowledge, indigenous nations, about global South. About the global South, we call it MAPA, so most affected people and area.
Yeah, I think you've very well described the challenge that we have, and that we cannot simply hope for a voluntary turn, no, which is not just CO, like some either greenwashing or actual CO2 emissions, which does not equal to real change, no, and to substantial change. I think you described this very powerfully, and you also described probably the opportunity that there is in using human rights language to actually also put question to power, no. But Arpitha, maybe you want to speak about also your on your research and your experience on how indigenous communities are fighting against the government. I don't know, probably if it's in mining areas, probably also against the mining companies themselves, who are a lot of times major emittents, or they are major emittents. And obviously that's a huge unequal struggle, no? So. Yeah, maybe you can also explain a bit more about how mobilization has been working around there and what the perspective is. And again, maybe I'm asking too much at one question, but also maybe you can also explain a bit more about this idea of rights of nature, because I have to say, the first time we discussed that in our office, some of my colleagues said, like, what is that kind of esoteric concept? This has nothing to do with rights. And then we went into discussion, which just, I love all my colleagues, they're wonderful, but which really shows that it's a very unusual thought for lawyers being trained in Europe, that you would consider, nature in relation to the human being as a right. But yes, so Arpitha, maybe you can speak on that.
Sure. That's quite a handful of questions. So just to sort of begin with my own fieldwork and what I've observed with legal mobilization. So one of the areas that I visited is where there's an expanding coal mine, and the Indian laws are structured as such that the state has complete control over the acquisition of land and continuing to dispossess the forest-dwelling communities. So in such a tight context, their ability to hold corporations accountable has been much more sort of in the setting of these kind of micro legal interventions. So trying to go to the local bureaucracy to ask for better terms of compensation, as well as going to courts, to kind of challenge the expansion of the coal mine. And they're using a lot of intersections of human rights and environmental law, which is very fascinating. So in some sense, they sort of, their argument is that the expanding coal mine is both harmful to the environment as well as their human rights. And it's been a challenge. They've had very, very small wins, because in such a context, it's very difficult to define what success looks like. So I think my interviews, a lot of them narrate about how just being able to hold the state accountable for better terms of compensation and being able to realize that is itself a win. So I think it's quite particular to these contexts and the kind of choices and legal opportunities that are available to these communities to be able to hold corporations accountable. But there are success, larger sort of, one may call it, discursive wins, where there was a case which I looked at where the indigenous community managed to push out a mining company from acquiring its sacred mountain. And this was, based on free, prior, and informed consent. So this is where I feel like the procedural aspects of human rights also come in really handy to be able to secure the rights of Adivasi and indigenous peoples. To speak the rights of nature, and I think César will have a lot more to add. It's an area which I kind of arrived at based on the interviews that I did with these communities, because they sort of identified the language of rights, both in terms of human rights, but also as it being relational to the forests and to the areas that surround them. So I guess in some sense, it's the coming together of stewardship, as well as this idea that one belongs to a larger ecosystem. So it's not like their rights operate in isolation of the rights of the forests or the other ecosystems. And that's an interesting idea. And I think jurisprudence, like the jury is still out on the logistics of implementing something like this, because it can also go on to exclude these communities, because one can then see the colonial notion of conservation again being replicated under the language of the rights of nature. So it's a very tricky question, and who represents nature is still again a difficult question. But I do see hope in this idea of stewardship and this idea of biocultural communities being able to articulate the rights of nature and secure rights of stewardship. But yeah, I'd like to hear what César has to say, because he's been doing a lot of thinking on this as well.
Yes, please, César. I would be also very interested to hear your opinion and thoughts on this.
Sure. Yes, this is a crucial question that speaks to the new challenges and also the limitations of human rights language and the architecture. Because so far, of course, we've been focusing rightly on the potential of the existing language and the institutional venues that the human rights world offer to the climate action and to climate activists. But of course, human rights is only one of the languages of social justice, and it has limitations of its own. And with regards to issues like the rights of future generations or rights of nature, it inherits the limitations of Western modernity. So it is a framework inherited from Western liberal enlightenment. And for all the contributions that worldview has made to realities or to developments like democratic societies and so on, of course, it also has its own limitations. I'll speak to the two specific issues that I just mentioned, the rights of future generations and the rights of nature. With regards to the rights of future generations, if you look at the text of the main declarations, conventions, treaties of human rights that have made crucial contributions to a more humane world for the last 75 years. So next year, we'll have the beginning of the celebration of the 75th anniversary of the UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Despite all those contributions, there's very little, if anything, in those texts about the rights of future generations. Someone whose work I admire greatly, George Monbiot, a British author and an op-ed writer at The Guardian, once wrote that in a conventional interpretation of human rights text, the current generation could fulfill everyone's rights, the rights of those alive today, and yet leave no planet for the future generations. And I think that this is not exaggeration, because back in 1948, the drafters of those rights were thinking about the huge inequalities around the world that unfortunately are still with us, the violation of rights of women, of religious minorities, and so on. But they weren't really thinking about the rights of future generations, the rights of those who have yet to be born. Indigenous peoples, on the other hand, have been thinking about the idea of the good ancestor, of living a good planet, an inhabitable planet, for as long as they've been around. So it's taken 75 years to the human rights community to come around to this view. And sadly, my generation was the one that had a chance to do this more in a more timely fashion, because 30 years ago, we knew from very public testimonies of scientists like Jim Hansen in the US in the late 1980s that we were destroying the planet, and we were the first generation to know that we were destroying the planet. And yet it's taken us 30 more years, and the impetus coming from movements like Fridays for Future for my generation and to start to do what we should have done 30 years ago. So that's one challenge, the rights of future generations. I see a lot of potential, and judgments like the one from the Constitutional Court of Germany make crucial contributions to this to this new frontier of human rights advocacy. And then the second frontier that I see a lot of movements, certainly indigenous movements, again, they haven't done this only for the last 10 years or so, but for the last 10 centuries, mainstreaming the idea that human rights rely on interconnection. And I can't avoid in a panel organized out of Berlin to mention Alexander von Humboldt, who was the first Western scientist to see what indigenous wise people had seen for a long time, which is that we live in a web of life, as von Humboldt put it, meaning that everything is interconnected. And scientists over the last 15, 20 years have given us very, very concrete findings. They have very concrete clues about how this works. I'll end by mentioning one specific initiative that illustrates this. With colleagues from biology and botany, experts in fungi, in the fungi world, I'll mention two books that I think that anyone interested in the intersection of human rights and the rights of nature should be reading. One is titled Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake, which really presents the world from the point of view of fungi, of underground networks. And the other one is Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard, the scientist who first tracked down the way in which trees communicate with each other and have sentience through mycorrhizal networks, the Wood Wide Web, as Nature magazine calls. Those and many other findings show us that, in fact, in reality, even by Western scientific standards, human beings are interconnected, not just with each other, but with the rest of the planet, with quote unquote nature, as Western science used to call it, anything that's not human. So, from my point of view, what some courts, organization, activists are doing in advocating for the rights of nature is to update law to the level that even Western science, let alone indigenous wisdom, has shown that in reality, as Lisa said, the world is not linear, the world is not made of isolated atoms, but rights need to be put in the context of relationships with the non-human world.
Thank you, César. I think you've very powerfully described, as you said, how we as lawyers need to update law. We as human rights lawyers also need to be more thinking in interdisciplinary ways and taking into account, as you said, both science coming from other areas like biology and not from law. But also take into consideration indigenous wisdom, so that we can actually grasp the complexities, of that the climate crisis really shows to us, and so that we can also try to develop a human rights law that has a more comprehensive answer to the complexities that you've wonderfully, and also Arpitha, that you really described right now. We're coming to the close of this session. And I have a question, first of all, to you, Luisa, but I think also Arpitha and César should really feel free to comment. And that is, in the first session of this series, Wolfgang Kalek and Alejandra Ancheta and Joshua Castellino, they discussed on how on human rights law and human rights lawyers, or even the human rights movement, needs to stay relevant for social movements. And so Luisa, what would that mean for you? That how would the human rights movement or human rights lawyers be relevant for Fridays for Future? What is your ideal view of the relationship?
Do you mean Fridays for Future should stay
No. The challenge is that we feel the human rights movement needs to be relevant to movements.
Yes.
So what is, and I'm sure you know, not being a human rights lawyer, have some thoughts on this. And this is what I'm very interested. And then I'm also, of course, interested in the thoughts of the lawyers here in this round. But of course, first of all, you. And please feel free, also be critical. We want to hear this.
Well, yes, actually, my sister happens to be a human rights lawyer. So I had, and she's quite a bit older than I am. So we had these discussions as long as I can think. Given that what you know, deriving from what I mentioned earlier, people won't fight for the rights they don't know they have. And it is the same situation for social rights as it is for environmental rights. And in environmental rights, it's maybe even a bit trickier because you need to draw lines and connect the dots. And there is this obvious expectation for, you know, climate movements to also argue in the light of human rights. But for a long time, of course, I mean, just in my experience and the movement here, this wasn't possible because, as I said, people don't know about the rights. And this is not something that can be, in my eyes, in my view, on the shoulders of climate activists, teenagers, children, but this needs to be one inherent part of the work of human rights movements, human rights organization. It's about mainstreaming the knowledge of those rights that we have and that are we deprived from, in varying nuances depending on where we are in the world, and about actively inviting movements, social movements, environmental movements to the table, empowering activists by very much not just spreading awareness, but also about taking up this fight for climate justice from this human rights standpoint, not isolated from each other, but collectively. And I think I'm a huge fan of burden sharing, meaning that I do really feel that for the human rights climate justice connection, we are dependent on the awareness from the human rights side, and from the proactive involvement, and to build those bridges. It won't be climate activists alone that do that job. And I do, especially maybe just talking from a German perspective here for a minute. There's so much to do, and it's Fridays for Future Germany actually once declined to accept a human rights award by an organization that we felt had done so little for any kind of climate justice work that it felt wrong to take this prize. I feel standing by the sideline and applauding activists sometimes when they do something for human rights, it's not what we need. And by doing that, in a sense, organizations, as good as their work sometimes is, become part of the problem. But what we need is really a global, struggle for human, social, and environmental rights to rise up. And for that, we cannot. We need everyone. We need everyone to proactively stand up and get started. For everyone to acknowledge that knowledge is power, and knowing about human rights and human rights violations, if that's in the environmental or in the social context, comes along with some responsibility. And I feel we have a long, long way to go there, especially, and I think that is also obviously now talking from a white northern perspective, especially around here. What I do also see, of course, but there are people who know much more about that this is different in other circumstances where climate justice is not a woke narrative, but the guarantee to exist in the future and in the present.
César, do you want to also comment on this?
Sure. I think there are two key types of tasks or contributions that the human rights movement can make to climate, to the very urgent existential crisis of climate change. One has to do with more classical but equally important human rights advocacy. So not everything has to be about completely new litigation or path-breaking jurisprudence, but some more well-established mainstream human rights work is crucial for the climate movement. What I mean, for instance, is the protection of climate activists, environmental activists in countries like India, or throughout Latin America, or in the Philippines and elsewhere. One of the main threats to climate action is the persecution of those activists who are holding governments and corporations accountable, for example, who are opposing very visibly, very courageously, open pit coal mines in those and other countries. So this slogan that I like, that someone coined, according to which, well, you got the power, we got your back, meaning we'll go to court for you, we will mobilize the transnational networks of protection so that those at the forefront of the climate struggle can continue to do their courageous job. And corporations in Canada or governments in the UK and elsewhere will push forward anti-protest laws to try to stem the tide or to cut the flow of political energy, of funding to this movement, because they know they can seriously put in danger a business, quote unquote, a business model that's no longer sustainable, meaning, for example, continuing to extract fossil fuels. And then on the more kind of forward-looking front, there are a number of new challenges that human rights activists and organizations need to address. One that we haven't spoken about because we haven't had a chance is actually one of the blind spots limitations of the German Constitutional Court's ruling, which has some, certainly people in this panel know, but it hasn't gotten so much attention in the news. The German Constitutional Court declined to find in favor of petitioners from Bangladesh and Nepal, who had joined, have filed an independent action to try to hold the German government accountable for the types of human rights impacts being felt very tragically already in Nepal or Bangladesh. The court said, well, I'll stop within the boundaries of the German state because that's my jurisdiction. This is the German constitution, and there are very good legal reasons for doing that. But of course, I'm not convinced by them. But it's probably kind of the mainstream of a constitutional law that stops at the boundaries of nation states. Now, climate harms and climate action or climate impacts do not stop at national borders, right? The carbon concentration is planetary. Carbon doesn't know about national boundaries, and the warming of the planet, of course, is a global phenomenon as opposed to a localized phenomenon. So pushing the boundaries of national jurisdictions, getting courts in countries like Germany or Canada or the US and elsewhere, and governments, of course, to acknowledge that it's global South countries that are suffering the worst of the consequences of the climate crisis is a crucial next frontier of human rights advocacy and litigation.
Arpitha, do you have also some thoughts?
Yeah, I think much has already been said. I guess one point I'd like to sort of quickly reflect on is on the relationship between social movements and human rights lawyers. I think with the climate crisis, I feel the relationship has to be mediated more with a sense of equity, and it has to transform to one where the lawyer starts to surrender power of how legal strategy is built to social movements. I think one of my big learnings through my fieldwork is to understand how the kind of sophisticated processes that social movements have in building legal strategy. So I think as lawyers, we need to sort of as César said, have their back and support them and sort of translate their legal asks into different kind of venues. And of course, support strategy building, but not colonize it. I think that's what I'd like to sort of leave with.
Thank you. I think this is a very perfect ending. Luisa had to leave us already, but I want to thank I want to thank you, César, and also Arpitha, and of course also Luisa for being with us. And I think yes, I'm very happy now also on how we've come around to say, to also describe quite positively what is it that the human rights movement can contribute, and something that also we at ECCHR have been discussing is that we do think, strengthening the transnational angle and also exactly, trying to give space to communities in the Global South in debates around climate justice here in Europe is very important. And César, as you pointed out, I think that is also one of the frontiers that need to be pushed. It's exactly this question of extraterritorial obligations of states, meaning, does the German government not have duties towards rights bearers in Bangladesh, for example? No. So I think those are some areas that we also feel that are very important to push forward. But also, I think, as you also, Arpitha, and all of you mentioned, being understanding probably the privilege that we have as human rights lawyers, the privilege of knowledge that we have, the privilege of access, especially if we're located in Europe and in the global north, and how we can really make use of these privileges so that they can benefit the agendas and of movements, and especially now that we talk about the climate movement. And I think also something that I would want to see more is that we are also connecting the struggles, because there are struggles of the indigenous communities in India for climate justice, and there's the struggle of Fridays for Future here, and I think at least in my ideal view, I think also some sorts of transnational litigation can contribute to connecting those aims and to making things visible that at least we have tried to develop to some regard on other areas of human rights law, and we do hope to contribute rather soon with that also to climate justice struggles. So thank you so much. I've really learned a lot from you today. Thank you for taking the time. And I do hope, and I guess I know we will continue the good discussion. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Miriam. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye. Bye.